Hey, so welcome back to the shop, friends. Today I want to show you how I create a perfectly flat face on rough sawn lumber without having a joiner. Stick around. So what I have here is a piece of rough sawn walnut and a piece of rough sawn cherry. And these two pieces will become a cutting board eventually. But what I need to do is I need to generate a nice flat face on each one of these boards, and then that will allow me to have a reference for the rest of the edges of the boards. If I run this piece of walnut through my planer, it will plane the opposite surface of the board to the contour of the other side. And what I mean by that, if it has twist in it, it'll have twist in it whenever I plane it. So what we need to do is have this board go through the planer without being able to move it all. Otherwise, the twist or the rotation or the cupping will show up on the other face of the board. So the way that I do this is I have a piece of MDF and I have shims and a glue gun. And basically I'm going to glue the piece of rough sawn lumber to this board, and I'm going to use shims to keep it from moving. And then we can run that through the planer, and that will create that perfectly flat face. Now this piece of cherry only measures 6 inches in width, so we can go ahead and glue it down and run it through the planer without causing any issue. But this piece of walnut measures almost 13 inches across, and if we try to run that through the planer, it's going to take a lot of material off in order to get it flat from edge to edge. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut this piece down the middle and table saw. That way I don't have to take as much material off to get that flat face. So we'll start out by planing this piece of walnut. And generally it seems to be more stable when you glue it down to the board if you put the cup surface down, meaning the concave surface points down, and that seems to allow it to be more stable on your piece of MDF. Now you can see as I just lay it down here, it's got quite a bit of movement in it. And that movement would be present also as it's going through the planer. So we need to go ahead and glue it down and shim it up so it won't move. Now this method of planing rough sawn boards is really quite simple. I just take these shims and I just put them in areas that there's a gap under the board, and just putting that one shim there has already stopped the board from wanting to rock. So I'll put those in a few different spots just to assure it's not going to want to move on me as it's going through the planer. So you can see there I've got 2 shims on the right side of the board. Now I've got 1 shim on the left side of the board. That takes up the gap that was underneath the board pretty well. Then if we look down the edge of the board, there's barely any gap at all there. Now when I try to rock the board, it doesn't move at all. I can't move it side to side, left and right. I can't make it twist or rotate. So now we just need to glue this down so it doesn't move as it's going through the planer. And I just use some hot glue, and I glue the shims in a few spots. The nice thing about the hot glue is it will just pop right off whenever you're done. It doesn't take a lot of glue as long as the board is pretty stable. You may be able to see I have some sandpaper that I've glued down to this board as well. This is the board I always use for planing rough sawn lumber or joining the surface of it. And that way it has a little bit of friction to keep it from wanting to move on the board as it runs through the planer. So now I can just let this dry for a couple minutes, and then we can run it through the planer and start to create that really flat surface on the top of the board. Now in setting my plane depth, I'm just going to go ahead and find the tallest spot of the board, and that's where I'll set my plane height to be. So it looks like this corner here is going to be the highest. Let's go around and make sure. Yeah, so these are, 'cause So it looks like this corner is going to be the highest off of the MDF board. So I'll set my plane depth to this height. You don't want to take too much material off at once. It's just going to destroy your plane blades, and then you risk knocking the board off of your plane sled or your piece of MDF. So I've got my dust collection hooked up. I've got my safety gear on, and I think I'm ready to run it through the planer for the first run. Don't forget to account for the thickness of your planer sled. I forgot to do that. So that was just one pass through the planer. And as you can see, I hope you can see in the camera, is we've planed this side almost all the way from the edge to edge. And then you can see that it goes down and then it comes across like this. So this was the higher portion of the board in comparison to this end. So what we're trying to accomplish is to bring this down level or flat with this part down here. So I don't think it's going to take but a few more passes to bring it down completely flat across. So that was a total of 4 passes, and we got the whole board with the exception of just the small corner here. I'm not going to keep planing it down to this corner because that corner will be cut off for the cutting board anyway. So now we can actually take this board off of the planer sled, and then we can mill it up into some square pieces. Before I take it off of the planer sled, I'm going to check it with my straight edge. So I'm just taking the straight edge and laying it on it long ways and seeing if I can see any light coming from underneath it. And I barely see any light at all. I mean, that is very, very flat. Probably flatter than I could get with a hand plane. Now the next test is using winding sticks to see if there's any twist in the board. And as I look down that board and I look along those winding sticks, I don't see any twist at all. So now we can go ahead and take it off of the planer sled. We don't need the sled anymore for this board. And then I can go ahead and do these other boards. It's really easy to get these off of here just using a chisel. It just pops right off. And then the glue, the hot glue just pops right off and it doesn't harm the wood at all. So I'm going to go ahead and do these other boards next, and then once that's finished, we can take these boards and turn them into perfectly square stock. And I'm going to use that stock for making a cutting board. For you guys, if this is totally like foreign to, like you've never done this before, let me just review what we did. This board was not square or flat in any way. It was twisted. You know, it just wasn't square at all. And what we did was we glued it down to a piece of MDF, which is a good reference material because it is very flat. We glued it down so it couldn't rock or twist or move while it was going through the planer, and that created a perfectly flat face. Now this face will serve as a reference for cutting 90-degree angles on the sides. It'll also serve as a reference for getting a perfectly flat and parallel face on the other side of the board. So this is really the first step with any project that you do when using rough sawn lumber. So next time I'll have a bunch of these pieces flattened, so we'll have a perfectly flat face. And then I'll take you through the steps of turning this into perfectly square stock so we can use it for some projects. This one particularly will be a cutting board. So that's all the time we have for today. I appreciate you guys watching as always. If this was helpful to you, if it inspired you, if it makes you want to get in the shop and do some projects for yourself, if it makes you want to build your own shop, please leave me a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video.